All right. So given that all reality is material, including the soul is material as well. And by the way, Epicurus says that the soul is composed of a very particular kind of atom. Okay, and this is why I said not all atoms were the same to the Epicureans. There are thin atoms and very sort of fragile atoms, fine atoms versus coarse atoms. The soul is made up of a very particular type of atom, a very fine atom that is spread throughout the body of living things, and things that don't have this particular atom are inanimate. And the reason why when we die, our bodies still remain behind, and yet we are all of a sudden dead, say the Epicureans, is because these particular atoms are so fine that they tend to disperse and they tend to lose their ability to be together much more quickly than coarser atoms. So it's like comparing a piece of wood with a fine piece of glass. So these atoms are like a fine, very thin piece of glass that can easily shatter. So the idea there is that for the Epicureans, all material things come into existence by way of atoms uniting for a time, and eventually these atoms disperse and the object no longer exists. The soul is also made up of atoms, these fine atoms, and so the soul cannot survive the death of the body. Okay, when the body goes, the soul goes, and the atoms that make up the soul are also dispersed. Which means, and this is where he transitions, Epicurus transitions into his moral philosophy, which means that there is no punishment or death after death. There's no punishment after death. And it doesn't make sense to lament death. You know, you can't be punished after death because there's no soul. And it doesn't make any sense at all to lament death because death is a nonsensical idea. In fact, the notion of death comes from the way we use language. It represents incorrect thinking. And it's incorrect thinking that comes from language, because language has a name for death, and it suggests, the way we use language suggests that death and being dead is something that a person can experience. I'm dead. Well, you can't be dead. There's no such thing as being dead. That's a nonsensical concept. So you can't experience death. And so given that you can't really experience death, you shouldn't fear death. There is no death. All there is non-existence, which is the destiny of all things, including ourselves. And because this is the way things are, the Epicureans said the best way to live one's life is to make the best of it. We have one life. We're all going to perish. Make the best of the life we have. So what does that mean? What's the best life? Well, the best life is a good life. And a good life is being happy. And how does one become happy? Happy is very ephemeral. But pleasure, well, pleasure is not ephemeral because pleasure is experiential. So to achieve happiness, you have to have pleasure. And so this could be reduced to a basic maxim. We ought to live life in such a way as to derive the greatest amount of pleasure possible through our lifetime and minimize pain. Have the greatest amount of pleasure and minimize pain. Okay, but this is not pleasure as in go out and drink until you're going to burst, or go out and have sex, like all the time. No, not that kind of pleasure. Pleasure is a very particular type of pleasure, and it needs to be understood more clearly. Epicurean pleasure is very much in line with the Aristotelian concept of the golden mean. For Aristotle, the mean is a balance between two extremes. At one end is excess, at the other end is deficiency. Too much, too little. For Aristotle, you want to find a balance in the middle. For Aristotle, the golden mean, the idea of the golden mean, was meant to measure moral action. So moral behavior is the mean between two extremes. For the Epicureans, on the other hand, the mean is used to measure a balanced and well-lived life. Okay, so the mean is a balanced and well-lived life. So the purpose of life, its telos, its end, its purpose is to maximize pleasure and avoid pain. And Epicurus advocated living in such a way, if you live your life, you live it in such a way as to derive the greatest amount of pleasure possible during your life, but doing so moderately, to avoid the suffering incurred by overindulgence in such pleasure. So, too much pleasure can actually cause pain. Gluttony, not a good thing. It's very pleasurable to eat and eat and eat, but then if you overeat, it's like you get sick and you're going to die young. Epicurus also argued, of course, that since it's an innate part of human existence to avoid pain and seek pleasure, we need to develop an understanding of what constitutes pleasure, right? Because people sometimes make a mistake. They think that this is going to be pleasurable, but that isn't actually going to be pleasurable. That's going to be painful if you think about it. So, he had to develop a philosophy of pleasure. What does it mean to experience pleasure? And what does it mean not to make a mistake or to err in our judgment when we are seeking pleasure and seek the wrong thing, believing that we're actually going toward pleasure, but in fact we're not. We're not going toward pleasure at all. So this is the philosophy that the Epicureans came up with. Basically, there are two types of pleasures: pleasures of the body and pleasures of the mind. And pleasures, I'm going to give a chart here to show you what the differences are. So pleasures of the body involve sensations of the body. So, for example, eating food, a delicious food, or being in a state of comfort, free from pain, is pleasure of the body. Existing only in the present, not worrying about the past, the future, is a pleasure of the body. And one can only experience pleasures of the body in the moment. That's a very important idea, because they only exist as a person is experiencing them. So pleasures of the body only exist as you are experiencing that pleasure. On the other hand, there's another very important kind of pleasure, pleasure of the mind, and pleasure of the mind involves mental processes and states. So things like joy and a lack of fear and pleasant memories and aspirations and the kinds of things that give meaning to our lives. Pleasures of the mind do not only exist in the present, but also in the past and future. since memory of a past pleasant experience or the expectation of some potentially pleasing future can both be pleasurable experiences. And because the mind, unlike the body, can encompass past, present, and future, they are considered to be greater pleasures than pleasures of the body alone. The greatest pleasure that a person could reach was the complete removal of all pain, both physical and mental. And the way to do this is to learn to control his or her desires. Desire itself is seen as a pain. So again, this is very reminiscent of Buddhism, right? Because of course, Buddhism also talks about controlling desire, because the desire can lead to misery. The Epicureans distinguished three types of desire. And they are, I'm just going to very quickly go through them: natural and necessary desire, natural but not necessary desire, and not natural and not necessary desires. So natural and necessary desires are limited desires that are innately present in all human beings. For example, the desire, and these desires are necessary for three reasons. They're necessary for happiness, they're necessary for freedom from bodily discomfort, and they're necessary for life. So clothing and food, for example, are such desires, right? So clothing would belong to the first two categories. Clothing is necessary for happiness. It's necessary for freedom from bodily discomfort. Food would belong to the third because it's necessary for life. Then you have natural but not necessary desires. So these desires are innate, just like the first type. They're innate to humans, but they do not need to be fulfilled for their happiness or their survival. So they're necessary, but they don't need to be fulfilled. For example, you might want to eat a delicious meal in a fancy restaurant and have the best food. The desire for food is obviously natural and necessary, but the desire for a certain type of food, or delicious food, or food that's special, that's not necessary. And in fact, seeking out those things can lead to a significant amount of anxiety, and therefore seeking, special stuff, special foods, and foods that are overly expensive and indulgent should be avoided, because the cost, the resources are more expensive than what you gain. You don't gain that much by having fancy food as opposed to just regular food. So for that reason, natural but not necessary desires ought to be avoided. And then finally, you have not natural and not necessary, and those desires are things like things that are not innate to human needs at all. For example, the desire for wealth or fame, or for things that ultimately can just leave us feeling a lot of discomfort, because we're probably never going to achieve them. They're not innate, they're not required for happiness or health. And because people often have, like, fame, think about social media. I mean, I can give you a specific example in social media. People start YouTube channels, and they want to get subscribers, and it doesn't matter how many subscribers they have, they want more. It's not enough. It doesn't matter how much attention they get. It's not enough. They want more. Like everything is done in order to get more attention. And the want is infinite and it's never satisfied. So that's what Epicureans talk about there. You know, those are desires that are not natural and they're not necessary. So if one was to only seek natural and necessary desires, then according to the Epicureans, one would be able to reach the highest form of happiness. Now, a teacher or a student of Epicurus, Philodemus of Gadara, had four basic principles on how one ought to live a good life in the Epicurean sense. He basically said, don't fear God, don't worry about death, what is good is easy to get, and what is terrible is easy to endure. Those are the four basic principles that he said Epicurean philosophy can be reduced to. Okay, just a couple of very quick Epicurean quotations, and then I'm going to open the floor up for discussion. So, argument against the existence of God. Even the Epicureans had one. God either wants to eliminate bad things and cannot, or can but does not want to, or neither wishes to nor can, or both wants to and can. If he wants to and cannot, then he is weak, and this does not apply to God. If he can but does not want to, then he is spiteful, which is equally foreign to God's nature. If he neither wants to nor can, he is both weak and spiteful, and so not a God. If he wants to and can, which is the only thing fitting for a God, where then do bad things come from? Or why does he not eliminate them? Okay, Epicurus on sex. I learned that your bodily inclination leans most keenly towards sexual intercourse. If you neither violate the laws nor disturb well-established morals, nor sadden someone close to you, nor strain your body, nor spend what is needed for necessities, use your own choice as you wish. It is sure difficult to imagine, however, that none of these would be a part of sex, because sex never benefited anyone. In other words, to have good sex, the resources required are such that it's probably just best to avoid sex altogether. And in fact, at one point, Epicurus was asked about sex, and he said, and marriage, and he said, nah, not interested in sex or marriage. I'm actually married to philosophy. So that was his answer to needs like sex and marriage. On friendship. Of all the things which wisdom has contrived, which contribute to a blessed life, none is more important, more fruitful than friendship. Friendship was very important to the Epicureans, the most important thing. And finally, just as a summary, Epicurus on pleasure in general. What's going on? I can't. Oh no. Oh, all right. When we say that pleasure is the end and aim, we do not mean the pleasure of the prodigal, like pleasure having to do with spending money or resources recklessly. That's not what pleasure is. Or the pleasures of sensuality, as we are understood to do by some through ignorance, prejudice, or willful misrepresentation. By pleasure, we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. It is not by an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and of revelry, nor not by sexual lust, nor the enjoyment of fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table, which produce a pleasant life. It is sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, and banishing those beliefs through which the greatest tumults take possession of the soul. All right, and then finally, a quotation that I found that I thought was brilliant and kind of summarizes it in a very modern sense. The life of pain and the life of pleasure both end in death. So which would you rather spend your limited time experiencing? And that is basically how the Epicureans would sort of deal with it if they were confronted with that question. All right, so that's it. We can talk.